welcome to Unsilenced. My name is Shelby Smith. I'm here this evening with Olivia, who has agreed to sit down and share a bit about her VCUG experience.
My name's Alivia, like you said, but it's fun because it starts with an A instead of an O. And I have to say that because that's one of my catchphrases. But I'm 24. I am from North Carolina, but I grew up kind of half of the time in Massachusetts, and I had my VCUGs up in Massachusetts. I don't know what the exact timeline is, but it was around like 6.5 to 8-ish years old. I had 3 spread out.
Do you feel like the VCUGs impacted your relationship with your family or friends?
1000% impacted my relationship with my family, specifically my mom. I think there was a lot of interpreted betrayal with our relationship because she never was in the VCUG room with me. They didn't let her, but she was the main one taking me to appointments, handling all the doctor stuff with me. And for any other doctor's appointments, I started reacting to them as if I was reacting to VCUGs. I was basically going into flashbacks anytime I was at the doctor's office. So it didn't matter if I was there just getting my vitals checked or I was there getting a shot. I freaked out and went into meltdowns every time. So yeah, definitely affected my relationship with my family. I think I was a lot more lighthearted and fun. I was always kind of somebody who had a more anxious disposition. I'm ADHD, so I'm hypersensitive to sensory input and stuff. So I was always on the more cautious of my surroundings side, but I went from being kind of just typically careful to being scared of everything that could hurt me. Yeah, I think I was very, very different afterwards. I think it really altered the way I perceived the world around me, both from a safety standpoint. I had zero trust in the world around me anymore. I had no sense of I'm gonna be okay. It was just everything's life and death, everything's survival. I'm gonna have to figure out how to get through this. Not just throwing a fit because my crayon broke, It was oh crap, my crayon broke, I'm the bad one. I don't know what I thought was gonna happen to me, but it was anything that ever happened, it was it was gonna go downhill quick and I was gonna have to survive. That was just how my thought pattern altered. But in a more obvious way, after my VCUGs, I started regressing to bedwetting again. I started getting aggressive night terrors, which persisted for routinely a couple years. But my mom used to say that she would wake up to me screaming all the time, and I was not even awake. I was just screaming, and that I would run down the hall and lock myself in the bathroom, and she couldn't get to me because I would just sit in there and scream. And that's horror movie stuff,
Yeah.
You think about that and you're that looks that sounds like it belongs in a horror movie. And that was pretty regular for me after my VCUGs.
Yeah. I mean, I had the exact same experience with the regression, and then the nightmares would, in a way, worsen the regression. It's I was living it in the dream, and then I would end up wetting the bed or whatever, and that just made you all the more embarrassed and humiliated and just lost.
Yeah, I think I was basically having nightmares and waking up and having flashbacks so intensely that I'm pretty sure I was still unconscious to a degree. The way my mom described it, she couldn't, I was almost catatonically in these night terrors. For her, it was jarring. For me, I was a kid, I don't remember it, and I was catatonic when I was going through them. So I don't really know what it was like, but I think if I saw it in third person, I would be really freaked out. One more thing I could add to it with childhood is I became very, very escapist. Everything was fantasy. I put my head into as many fantasy books as I could. I read my life depended on it, and it was very much a dissociative mechanism because I wasn't reading the books and then going to my friends and talking about, oh, Harry Potter, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. My friends would ask me what's happening in the book? And I'd have zero idea. I could read the book cover to cover 3 times and probably barely give you the major plot points because it was a way to completely dissociate. It was get out of Olivia head and get into something that doesn't exist. And my brain I feel like used dissociating as a coping mechanism a lot.
I definitely relate to that. Just like I don't know, just the really intense reading constantly, but not as a means to connect, just as a means to dissociate. I guess another huge aspect of this would be like your intrapersonal journey. How did the VCUG impact your sense of self and like esteem and self-image and self-worth?
I think it made me a lot more withdrawn. I think I was instantly like less sure of myself. I think I had a lot more social anxiety afterwards. Like I wasn't as confident in just interacting with people in my peers. I really don't think I had any friends until like 5th grade. And I had my VCGs they ended when I was in 3rd grade. So I think I kind of just withdrew entirely. So interpersonally, it definitely affected me in that way. I just like shut down. And vulnerability wise, had no bandwidth to be vulnerable at all with anyone unless it was like forced vulnerability, where I was having a panic attack or I was throwing a fit or something like that. It wasn't actually me feeling like I could talk and express things or get help. It was just like a shutdown. So it definitely impacted my sense of self. I started to believe myself to be like less than others, like less human than other people. I started thinking I was like, something was wrong with me all the time. Later on, I like would tell my mom like, there's something wrong with me. She'd be like, you're just a normal kid. I'd be like, no, like there's something wrong with me. Cause I just like was so affected by it that I was living with PTSD. So that was the wrong, you know, and having gone through it was the wrong, but I was having all of these symptoms and like reactions and lived expression of like post-traumatic stress that all turned and became a reflection on who I was instead. I was very much like I just thought that I just wasn't like everybody else. The blog post I did is on Unsilenced now, basically like a parallel between a dream I had recurring afterwards. It was basically a trauma processing dream where I was a mermaid. And I was being experimented on. That also impacted my sense of self. For a while, genuinely like thought that I was a mermaid. Like, and I was a kid, you know? So, I mean, kids think that kind of stuff all the time, but like genuinely thought that that's why I had the procedures I had was because I was less than human and that I would one day like sprout a tail and then I would have to hide again because they would come after me. Such a real cognition for me. Like it was like an inevitable point in my story to me. I was like, well, one day I'm gonna be at the beach with my family and I'm just gonna have to dive into the ocean and never come back.
It's like so logical though when you think of it from the child's perspective. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. I was like trying to escape to like Dragon Tales, that show, and they sing the song. I was like, they'll take me back just because you don't feel like you belong anywhere.
Yeah, that was a big part. I was like not feeling like you belong. And I couldn't be friends with anybody because I didn't think anybody was safe. There was no room for it. I was like, if I don't think I 100% won't get hurt by you, then I'm just not going to let you in my life at all.
Exactly. Such a tragic loss too, you know?
Yeah, it is sad. Like you think of like a kid who can't risk letting anybody in. And I came from a family that was generally stable, you know? I can't imagine like how much more so this would alter the worldview of somebody who's from an unstable family.
I think that often myself, especially after finding out, because like my parents, you know, they were together, we were middle class, and there were definitely a lot of underlying issues, but like I cannot help but always think of the kids who are already in dysfunctional families with neglect or abuse or like alcoholism, like any of those things, they're so common in our culture today. And I can't imagine it because it was hard enough to stay alive, like in my family, which was also relatively stable.
Yeah. Even though I like touched on all this like PTSD stuff and like night terrors and yada yada, I didn't realize that I was like actually living with trauma memories until I was 15 years old, I think. And it's because we were living in North Carolina before that. We moved back to Massachusetts, which was where everything happened, where all the hospitals were, where my old house was. Environmentally, that was like going back to the place where everything had taken place, where I was sick, where things got really bad. So moving back to Massachusetts was like getting hit with a 18-wheeler. Like we moved back and I was instantly like severely depressed, anxious, panic attacks all the time. I was homeschooled at the time, so I couldn't make any friends, couldn't build connections really with anybody. Everything kind of came back. I was not happy to move back up there. I was very, very caught off guard by like all of a sudden anxiety is bad, depression is bad, panic attacks are bad. My sleep is horrible. Like I'm waking up 7 times in a night, trying to fall asleep for an hour and a half and getting nowhere. Being hypervigilant ruled my normal day. That was kind of how my teenage years really kicked into like feeling like I was a teenager, and then also like I was not well.
I just cannot fathom how much worse it would have been being 15. I feel like 15 is the year for girls where everything gets a little skewed, you know, going into puberty like that.
Yeah. And that's when I was realizing like things had happened. That's when I was realizing that like the procedures were actually bad. And I didn't even have the vocabulary of VCUG in my memory. It was just there's a reason why every time I go to the doctors, I'm absolutely out of commission. It was like bleeding into every part of my life. I mean, I was angry. I was really angry, like with my parents all the time. I was angry for where we were living. I grew up in an evangelical household, and faith was pretty important to me starting like 11, 12 years old. I was angry at God. I was like, there's nobody who cares about me, and like God's supposed to care about me, and obviously he doesn't if I'm like this. Even with family, with anything that was supposed to care about me, it was suddenly like another round of betrayal trauma where I was like, I should not be going through this. And I didn't really know like how to plan my future. It impacted my relationships with friends. Once I did get them, I was like not vulnerable at all. I wasn't really building deep friendships. Anytime anybody was like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do when you get out of high school? Absolutely zero plan. I didn't think I was going to make it. Like, I just thought I was going to die. And that sounds so dramatic. Like, people are like, what do you mean you thought you were going to die? Like, I just did not think that the world was safe enough for me to live that long. I wasn't planning or actively like trying to find ways or anything like that. But I was heavily idealizing it. And in my head, I don't need to care about what I'm going to do in the future because something's going to take me out and then it'll be done. That was just how I thought about the world. But with dating and stuff, I was the single friend. I was the one who wasn't boy crazy. All of my friends, like when I was starting to build friendships who were dating and this and that, they were like, Olivia, you're still single, you know? And I was like, I want nothing to do with them. I was like, I have no reason to open myself up to getting hurt like that. In my head, it was just another risk. Like it was just another unnecessary danger to myself that I knew was going to be triggering. I didn't really start dating until I was like 17. And even then, like I have this vivid memory of my boyfriend at the time, it being New Year's, and he wanted to kiss me and I did not want to kiss him. And I was like, no, I can't do it. Like I knew it was going to trigger me. Anything that was related to intimacy, whether it was just kissing or hand holding or whatever, like it was just the gateway. And I was like, that door is going to open and then I'm not going to be able to keep anything from happening to me. I don't want anything. Like I don't want to go there, open the door. And it was New Year's Eve and everyone's celebrating. And I'm like, can't do it.
It like robs you of the normal life that most girls get.
There was no excitement, you know, like it was survival. It really was. It wasn't like, oh, I get to have my first boyfriend and go on little dates. Like, sure, maybe there was like a small element of that, but so much of it was overshadowed by this like intrinsic, I have to make sure that this is safe. I have to make sure that this is not going to backfire on me. I have to make sure that I'm not put in danger. It was all on me to protect myself because I didn't have anybody protect me from the VCUGs. So everything that could be a risk was way catastrophized. It wasn't like a normal cutesy thing.
Yeah. And I think what's so powerful about your story too is just the fact that people who have an inability to understand this as sexually traumatic, you know, like you're speaking of anything related to intimacy was just off the table. And it's like very drastic the ways that this impacted your life, not necessarily like sexually, but just like intimacy and romance and relationships with friends or with partners. Like it's all connected. And I think that's one of the saddest parts about this trauma that people don't really understand.
It is, yeah. It 100% is connected. In my mind, I was like, if I let anybody kiss me, they're gonna rape me. That was it. That was the conclusion. I was like, if I let anybody do anything remotely close, that's it. I'm gonna lose all my control and I'm done. At that point, I think I did have this like sense in my head of like, if I have to go through something like that again, it's gonna take me out. I just didn't think that I could risk anything, really. I didn't think I could risk being in a relationship. I didn't think I could risk having emotions for people romantically. I was never like a girl who like grew up and looked at guys and had crushes on them because I thought they were cute. Like it was more of like a personality thing. Because to me, like anything to do with bodies was just like a unsettling trigger.
I'm really glad you said that. That's something I've always been like, I don't know, insecure about myself, and there were also those thoughts of like, oh my gosh, what's my sexual orientation? I'm so confused.
No, I
Yeah.
1000% thought I was asexual. I was just so traumatized. I had no bandwidth for it, really. Really thought I was ace. Like all these people would be like, oh my gosh, he's so hot. He could be butt naked and I would want to look away. Like to me, it was just like the vulnerability of all of that and the intimacy of all of that. I couldn't stomach any of it. So I think that's really common. I think we tend to go two ways, as it's either like sexuality gets shut down or it becomes like hypersexual when you're coping with that sexual trauma, or it's a mixture of both.
Well, it's like when you're one strike away from it all falling apart, from feeling like you're going to fall apart or die. Like I so deeply relate to those sentiments you had about like, well, I'm probably going to die. Something's going to kill me. Like whatever happens next will definitely finish me off.
Yeah. And that was such like a pervasive belief. It's weird. Like you think that way. You think like imagining your whole worldview through that lens is like, geez, like how pessimistic, like how jaded. And I have compassion for the me that thought that way. I wish I didn't have to think that way at all. I wish I could have grown up and felt normal.
As a person who's also married to a man, for me personally, like marriage was such a new season to enter into. I happened to learn about my test like in the middle of it, so I don't know how much that impacted it, but I do know that it's a lot of hard work and it's a lot of emotional labor. Is that something you relate to, or would you happen to have maybe any advice for people who are also married?
When I met my husband, I knew, like, and some people don't, but I knew. I was like, if I start talking to him, I'm going to eventually like him. I'm going to eventually date him. I'm going to eventually marry him. If we're married, we're going to be doing stuff intimately that I am terrified of, that I don't know if I can get through, that I don't know how that even happens consensually. A couple of weeks into us admitting that we liked each other, I basically sat him down and was like, just so you know, I'm not kissing you till we're married. I'm not doing anything physical till we're married. I tried to scare him off. Really, I tried to scare him off. I tried to be like, you don't want me because I don't want to do anything with you. It didn't work. He was like, that's fine. Like, I'll wait. Like, there's no pressure, all of that. He's really been great. But I had to learn how to be comfortable with holding hands. I had to learn how to be comfortable with hugging more than 2 seconds. I had to learn how to be comfortable sitting on the couch. I had to learn how to feel comfortable with his arm around me. For a while in the beginning of our relationship, was getting triggered, flinching from him putting his hand on my arm because I thought I was going to be held down. It was a process. I guess the biggest advice I could say is to just take it at the pace you need to and stop pushing yourself into things that you're not sure about. And if you are going to push yourself, it's more important to be emotionally vulnerable than physically vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Because you can't feel like you're making progress. You can't feel like you're doing it for you. You can't feel like you're safe unless you've gotten the emotional safety. I could sit there and force myself to kiss him, but if I was completely emotionally shut down, I was hurting myself and I was hurting him. This is going to sound weird, but I think in our situation, it's really easy to try and force yourself to endure things that aren't feeling safe because that's what you have to do with VCUGs. And so I had to learn to be my own advocate. If I wasn't 100% comfortable, stop. If I wasn't 100% on board with something, stop. If I was feeling triggered, stop and cry. Mm-hmm. Actually let yourself cry. Actually let yourself cry and cry with sound. Because that was such a big thing for me for 90% of my life. I physically could not cry without it being silent. I had to learn how to cry with my vocal cords and not just let tears fall. And I had to learn how to do that with my partner and be willing to show that to my partner and be willing to ugly cry with my husband, because I couldn't do anything with intimacy without having that emotional safety first. So
yeah. And it's all the harder just because you didn't have it for your whole life. And it's learning that as a young adult is so difficult. You know,
Yeah.
you're reparenting and reteaching yourself and relearning these things that everyone else learned, but you didn't. And that's
Yeah.
really tough.
Yeah. And you know, like a lot of people learned like, okay, you cry and then you drink a glass of water and you move on with your day, you know? And to me, it was like, no, like you can't do that. You got to tough it out. You got to survive it. Like you can't be vulnerable or else it all falls apart. So crying was a big learning curve. Even before emotion, like physical intimacy, I had to learn how to cry so that I could be emotionally intimate, so that I could be comfortable with physical intimacy. And we took things super slow, you know, take things really slow, cuddle a lot and make out a lot without doing anything. Sorry if that's like too like explicit, but like if you can do that and not have any expectations, you know, you get more comfortable when you take away expectations.
That's so true. When me and my husband, we took like a premarital course back
We
at
did
our old
too.
town. Yeah. And that was one of the things they said, like, it's really important to be able to be physically affectionate without all roads lead to here. And I think it's just such a healthy thing to do. And I'm really glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, that's healthy for anybody, especially for people who have been through what we've been through. Like, at least in my case, if all roads led to there, no thanks, I won't do any of it.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
that's
I'm
how
gonna
I
go the
thought.
other road.
If all roads go there, then just count me out, whatever. Because you're able to foster like physical intimacy that isn't sexual, that made a big difference for me.
I thought it was so well put what you were talking about with the emotional intimacy. That's something I'm like actively working on still
Oh,
today,
it's
but like
hard.
it's very hard, but it just seems so foundational to everything. Marriage, sure, of course, but also just like I can apply that to any area of my life and be like, yeah, I can do better, you know, and that's what builds the trust.
Yeah, and you have to be able to feel like you can trust somebody. Some people can just like do things and they don't care, but I'm not wired that way. With how hypervigilant like I've been, that was such like a pivotal foundation piece for me, is having that emotional intimacy. So I had to bite my pride and swallow it and let myself cry like a little baby in front of my husband.
I think that's so beautiful. I really do. And it's also just comforting, like as a fellow survivor, to hear and like connect with other women who are kind of experiencing the same hardships. Cause I do feel like it does look a little different as a young married couple, you know?
It does, yeah. I think different circles, things are very different. Cultural things play in. You know, I grew up evangelical, and there's a lot of good in that. And there was also very harmful things that I heard growing up, and that completely contributed to my bad worldview. In teenage years, I had heard from people like, oh, well, even if you don't want to do something and your husband wants to do something, you do it. And even if you're not feeling like it, but your husband wants something, like, then you give it to him. And to me, who's already traumatized with her body being violated, I was like, then why would you be married? Like, why would you want that for yourself? So my view of marriage beforehand was really toxic before I learned and talked through all those things and did premarital counseling and all of that. But for a while, I was like, if that's how it works, why would anybody want to be married? Like,
yeah, from the woman's perspective, it's like, does that sound good to you? Does that sound godly? And I mean, for me, the answer is definitely no. I definitely relate to that.
You know, I'm grateful my husband has come from a good background, the positive side of the evangelical experience.
Yeah.
And he 100% was great with consent and understanding all of that and wanting enthusiastic consent. Key thing for perception was me just thinking like, oh, if you're married, then obviously you get raped all the time. Like that was just what I thought. You know, now been married and been in therapy for a couple years and done all the work, and really like the word for when you're just like sitting there pushing your body through a bunch of mud, walking through really, really thick mud. That's what it feels like, is you're just constantly doing the work. It's worthwhile work. Does it suck we have to do it? Yeah. Does it stink that we're in the position that we've learned all these negative things that we have to unlearn? Yeah, but I'm glad that I'm where I'm at now and I've done so much work.
You put that so well. You articulated that just perfectly. Because I feel like that's always the complicated thing for me to put into words. Because I feel like one of the biggest elements of like healing from this trauma too is just taking back your agency. And that starts with realizing you have it, which is harder than you think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, 100%. That was so many of my therapy appointments was I'd be like, well, if I go to the doctors and I do this, then they're going to do this. And she'd be like, what if you say no? I'd be like, is that how that works? Like, am I allowed to be my own person and to make my own choices and have control over my body? Like,
who knew?
Is that a concept that people just live by.
Who told them that? Yeah.
Yeah, I had to learn it. I really had to learn a lot of those things. I think it's worth mentioning that I didn't get diagnosed with PTSD until I was 20 or 21. And everything happened when I was six to 8 years old. And if you're in that field at all, you know that to be diagnosed, you have to meet certain criteria. There has to be a certain level of frequency and duration and like the way it impacts your life functionally. The fact that all of my symptoms were still that strong 12 years later, strong enough for me to get diagnosed and to warrant EMDR and like other significant treatment modalities, that I think says a lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to like listen to like VCUG trauma and not really understand like the full-on impact it has. I was diagnosable 12 years later. That's a significant impact. Worked on it for 2 years in therapy, and I had already been in therapy for a couple years, but nobody like officially told me like, hey, yeah, like you 100% are living with this. And that was wild to have lived that long, thinking there was something wrong with me, thinking that I was broken or something was messed up, then to hear like finally like, yeah, like this is what it is, was...
It's unbelievable, you know?
It is unbelievable. It's like, how do you live for 12 years with PTSD and not like actually know it?
Especially with people who know you, never telling you. Like you said, you were in therapy for years before. So was I. I was there for domestic violence and sexual assault. And not once did anyone think to say, like, there's something else going on here, you know?
Yeah. My relationship with my family, I don't think I harbor any more like resentment or bitterness towards them for not getting me help sooner. For a while I did. Especially in like the heat of it when I was like 15, 16, 17 years old, I would sit there and be like, how do you not look at me and think I don't need help? How do you not see how I was acting as a child and not bring me to somebody? My mom actually did bring me to the doctors, which I hated the doctors, so it wouldn't really... Yeah, she brought me when I was going through all the night terrors. And she was like, she's having night terrors all the time. Like, I don't know what to do. And they were like, oh, she'll grow out of it. Like, it's fine.
Of course they said that.
They were like, no, she's just, her brain's developing. She'll grow out of it.
Same reason they say, well, forget the VCUG, I'm sure.
Yeah,
your brain's just developing.
Like,
it's fine.
Your brain's developing. It's fine. Like, you're not waking up hallucinating things. I had these horrible night terrors for years, and like, I was just growing, you know?
Everyone goes through this.
Yeah, like that's just a normal thing. Waking up screaming, normal thing. Yeah, 12 years later, PTSD. Well, it's just wild, like the disconnect.
It definitely points to a really big, like, broken piece of the system.
Yeah. Every single time I go to the doctor's office, I'm like shaking in my boots, panic attacks, dissociated, freaking out, you know? And they would have me do the depression screener and the GAD-7, the anxiety screener and stuff like that. And I would fill them out and they'd always be horrible scores because I was actively having panic attacks in the office. And they'd take my vitals and my heart rate would be through the roof. And they're like, what's going on? Like, are you nervous? I'm like, I'm having a breakdown. But
we're past nervous.
Yeah, it wasn't taken seriously. I can't tell you how many times I told doctors I have medical PTSD and they brushed it off completely.
Yeah.
Before I was diagnosed, I was telling doctors that just to try and shock them into listening to me, and they would just brush it off. And to this day, like when I did get my medical records, there's a bunch of them that say like severe depression or severe anxiety or severe this. And it's like, no, I wasn't depressed. I was having panic attacks in your office. I was telling you it was medical PTSD and you were disregarding it. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And if I was depressed, it was because I had PTSD, like not because I had a clinical depression. That gaslighting is kind of crazy.
It takes a huge toll and it really does affect your ability to advocate for yourself later.
Yeah. And that sucks because my chart, like my long-term historical records say depression in a couple places on them. And I don't meet criteria for depression as somebody who's going into the mental health field. And even then, if I did meet criteria, it wasn't the presenting problem. That was the extra side effect of me living with PTSD and ADHD. So executive dysfunction and post-traumatic stress disorder do not go well together.
No.
when they're like, do you want to get out of bed? Do you want to do this? How much do you feel happy? Of course I didn't feel happy. Like, I was
It's hard to
living,
feel anything.
yeah, I was numb. I
Yeah.
look at it now and I look back and I'm like, the signs are glaringly obvious. If I had had one doctor before the age of 15 take the way I was reacting seriously and refer me to help and tell my parents, hey, I think the level of distress that your child is experiencing is way too high, and I think she needs to see this type of therapist or specialist, and referred me, I would have been probably way better off way earlier. But it messes up their worldview to consider that the place that they work within is the place that messed me up so badly. It really is. Like, I think it makes people question whether they're doing the right line of work and whether they're, harming people or whatever. And they just would rather not look at it.
Yeah.
And yeah, because it's just crazy. It's like all these signs. And if somebody had taken me at my word,
Just like believed you. Yeah. It's
just
that
believe.
simple.
Like,
It's like, is the patient saying what's true about her body, or do you know her body better than she does?
Yeah. It's like literally just believe it. Like if somebody says they have medical PTSD and they're in your office and their heart rate is through the roof, like, okay, then believe it and say, well, do you want to be referred to somebody? Do you want to consider mental health therapist? I wish somebody had seen like 8-year-old Olivia and recognized how impactful the procedures were and got me help when it would have, been appropriate in my developmental stage.
Yeah. And I feel like, I can't speak for anyone, but I feel like one of the personal reasons I'm so dedicated to this movement is just the obligation to stop other kids from living it that way. Like even seeing the younger survivors who are close to your age at the time, like recovering from it, it brings me so much like fulfillment to see them getting the support that I really needed.
It's really hard to put into words, but I haven't been able to interact with a lot of kids who have been through the same thing, only like vicariously through silence. But just knowing that there's kids like experiencing the same thing causes such grief, such like heart-wrenching grief for me that I won't talk about it too much because I will start crying. If I could like interject and be the person that I needed when that was going down, that would 100% be fulfilling. It would just make me feel like things have gotten better. And even if I had to go through it, like just because I had to go through it doesn't mean other people should go through it. I would rather other people not go through it because I don't think anybody should have to.
I know I was really hazy as to why it was still being performed. When I found out, I was absolutely shocked. I was like, wait, this is still a thing? Like I just assumed it wasn't. In terms of what's changed, obviously we're advocating for reform and an eventual replacement, and we're not going to tell any parents like what they should or shouldn't do. But in terms of the medical necessity, are there any like noticeable changes you see from your experience, or do you have any comments about the medical necessity of your procedure or any thoughts on that side of it?
I had really bad VUR. I had grade 3 in one and grade 4 in the other. So it was severe. I had been on antibiotics for bladder and kidney infections for a year straight already. In 3rd grade, when I was 8 and I was towards the tail end of all of this, I was only 40 pounds, barely. And I was marked failure to thrive on my medical records because of how small I was, how slowly I was growing, how much toll having kidney infections was taking on my body. So for the first one that I had, you could probably argue it was medically necessary. That said, my parents did not know the risks. They barely got any informed consent. They basically told them that if I didn't get this test, that I was just going to keep having kidney infections and eventually my kidneys would need replacement or they would fail entirely. My parents did it the first time because they really thought like that was the only option. They didn't know there was other options. And they already knew that I was having VUR without doing the test. Like all the signs were there. They didn't need me to have the VCUG to confirm that VUR was what was giving me the infections. You don't have like a bladder infection travel to your kidneys without some level of backup. There were certain signs that showed that I was experiencing VUR. So yeah, the first test, perhaps you could say it was necessary, but there were so many things about it that weren't done in the right way, that were gone about the wrong way, that could have been avoided. So the first time I had the corrective surgery, It failed. They did another VCUG, proved that it didn't work, obviously, which I'm pretty sure once you have that surgery, you're not supposed to have VCUGs, right?
That's the thing that really angers me about this is that you look anywhere on the internet, it's going to tell you something different. In my opinion, you shouldn't need the VCUG. If the point of the VCUG is just to diagnose VUR, I mean, what are we doing?
Yeah. I had VCUG corrective surgery, failed, another VCUG, another corrective surgery, the same one, failed again, another VCUG. And the third VCUG, they told my parents, like, we've done 2 surgeries, it's not working, we really have to figure out what's wrong, blah, 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 you know. I have the third VCUG. Obviously, I'm still having reflux. And at that point, they told my parents, your daughter needs to have a ureteral reimplantation operation. And if she doesn't, she's going to live with a bag for the rest of her life. That was it. Like, it was that catastrophic. And I remember my mom telling me, because I was like, Mom, like, what? I have to get another surgery. I've already had 3 VCUGs. I've already had 2 surgeries. I've already been on antibiotics for a year. You know, I'm 8 years old. And I'm like, why do I have to get another surgery? I've already been under anesthesia this many times, you know? And she's like, the doctor said, if you don't get an operation, you're going to have to live with a bladder that's a bag outside of your body. And I was like, well, then, I mean, I don't want to carry around my own bladder. So, I mean, that was that. And I had the cross trigonal, I think is how it's called. But basically, both my ureters, they snip them off and they crisscross them and they reattach them.
Oh, okay. Another survivor I interviewed, and another, I think like at least 2, mentioned like how blackmailed their parents felt, like, and how the language was so graphic. And it was like, you must have this VCUG or your child will die.
Yeah.
I don't know at what point we flip-flopped a diagnostic test with treatment. If your surgeries aren't working, that's clearly an issue with your surgeries. The VCUG is not going to fix it any more than the surgery will.
No,
you know?
no. And that's the thing is I think it really feeds off of the emotional and physical exhaustion that our parents are under when their children are suffering to this level makes them so much more susceptible to agreeing to whatever doctors push on them.
They're desperate.
They're desperate. I mean, my mom is watching her, at this point, 7-year-old kid who's been on antibiotics for a year, year and a half, had 2 failed surgeries, had all these tests, and nothing's working. Of course, the doctors are going to say, do this and this, and she's going to feel like she has to agree, you know?
Yeah.
The position that my parents are in, I understand where informed consent becomes less, now it should be more emphasized, because you know that the parents are in a vulnerable state of mind.
Yeah, and ever since I found the term legally effective informed consent, it's led me to realize that for most of us, there's no way informed consent was given, because it cannot be given without explaining all reasonable information to the parents in a way that they understand. Like that, those are key words included in this doctrine. They have not been following this for 34 years.
In my third VCUG, that was like the last one my mom 100% would not let me have anymore. I don't know if I mentioned it or not in a different post, but she's a CSA survivor. Mm-hmm. She started recognizing that I was reacting the same way. My younger sister had VUR as well, and the doctors pushed for her to get a VCUG. And after witnessing how I was reacting, my mom had to fight tooth and nail to get my sister sedated for a VCUG.
Wow.
Still pushed her to have a VCUG. She had to fight tooth and nail to get her sedated. And my sister was not necessary at all. Number one, it's genetic. You have an older sister and a younger sister experiencing the same symptoms, and you don't think that it's enough cause to think like she's probably experiencing VUR too. For my sister, 1000% was not necessary. That grieves me. You know, I'm glad she was sedated. I'm glad that she was a lot younger. I know it still affects those of us who are younger, but I'm glad that she's not as connected to it as I am.
That's an interesting piece of your story, that your sister had the same
thing, except she had the corrective surgery and it worked.
In the Stat News article, that family they interviewed, I believe it was the Donahue family, mentioned that if they had known what they know now, they would have opted for like the immediate valve correction surgery. If a child is suspected to have high-grade VUR, it just makes sense, you know? But because it's not disclosed to parents as an option, let alone any of the reasonable alternatives, it's like, what are they going to do? They're just going to agree to the VCUG.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because a lot of heartache could have been avoided, you know? I really genuinely think I could have avoided living with PTSD for this long.
It makes you wonder what it could have been.
It does. You know, I feel like I would have lived such a different childhood. I would have lived such a different teenage years. I would have really experience life in a different way. You know, I definitely have a lot of like autobiographical memory loss where I cannot keep track of chronological events in my own life. I don't know what came first. You know, when I was this age, what happened? Like, there's so much missing, foggy memory, like dissociating from the VCUG and having to cope with that and live with PTSD for so long made my childhood like almost non-existent.
It's just so fractured.
Yeah, very fractured.
Yeah.
Very, like, in my head, there's like a couple core memories of childhood and some very vague, like, well, I lived here and then I lived here and I went to this school. And the majority of my childhood, including my teenage years, is just gone. Like, I don't have memory of it. And I've had friends notice it where my friend will be like, oh, we watched this movie together. And I'm like, no, we didn't. And she's like,
Yeah.
we went to the movie theaters. Like, you and me and this person, we went to the movie theaters. We watched this when it came out. And I said, no, like, I have zero memory of that. The craziest one was actually my sister. And I watched a lot of like Markiplier videos growing up. And we watched like a whole series, probably like 25 something hours of this certain game that's like really cute. It's called Slime Ranchers. But we apparently watched this whole series together. We're super into it, like super thrilled about the game and the way it was and all of that. And last year I got an Xbox and I saw Slime Ranchers and my sister was over and she goes, oh, we watched that game. And I was like, no, we didn't. She was like, yeah, we did. And I was like, well, I'll download it. We'll see if it's familiar. I download it. I'm ecstatic. I'm like experiencing this game for the first time. Like, this is so cute. This is so fun. And she's like, Olivia, we watched this entire game. Like, you know what happens. And I'm like, no, I don't.
The dissociation.
Yeah, the dissociation. No recollection whatsoever. So that's kind of crazy that I can just entirely play a game that I've watched 30 hours of gameplay of and just think it's brand new.
Yeah, that's a very powerful part of, I feel like, living with PTSD. In young adulthood, I had the same issues and I still have the same issues today, even just like recalling things, timelines for grad school applications or whatever. It's like, yeah, I don't know what year that was, but this happened at some point, you know?
Yeah, it's just like like you said, fractured. It's like, instead of having like a linear calendar, I feel like I just have a bowl with a bunch of marbles in it. This is my life. But if you asked me to put them in order, I'd have to sit there and work.
The worst outcome of this procedure on your life as a whole, because there's just so many things, which one would you say would be like the toughest or the hardest to come to terms with in your healing journey?
I don't know. Hard to place like a one worst outcome when I feel like there's a whole storehouse of grief that it's caused me. The most easily pinpointed one is like feeling like I lost my childhood, you know, feeling like I lost my innocence, that I lost my ability to just grow up and learn about life in a way that wasn't stonewalled by all of this trauma, you know. Yeah. I think that's the biggest obvious one. There's a bunch of stuff in there, but
yeah, that is a really, really, really crappy part. It's like not just mourning the person that you could have been. Even after you come to terms with that, I feel like it's still difficult to think that like I should have had that, but I didn't.
For sure. That's a big part of it. Is like you go through things that people should not have to go through. And I relate with people who are CSA survivors and SA survivors and stuff like that, because nobody should have to go through that. Nobody should have to survive that and cope and move on. They do, and I do. To me, that's just very grief-inducing.
Yeah, obviously, like you said, you've been in therapy for a couple years, you've done a lot of healing, you've done a lot of work. Now you're going into the mental health field, which we love to see it. We need more people like you. In terms of finding Unsilenced, seeing other survivors face to face, is there anything you want to share about what that experience was like for you when you found the movement or when you found the support group?
All the love to Unsilenced. When I first found it, I totally rabbit holed. And I read way too many things all at once, and I bashed myself over the head with all the content, and I set myself back because I was so alarmed, like, at the fact that my experience wasn't my own, that it was my own, but it wasn't just me. Like, I was validated and I was pissed. All of the working I had done in my head to like, okay, doctors and stuff and medical professionals, like I can stand up for myself, like I can use the system for my good, stuff like that. Oh my gosh. I was like, that's it. I don't trust it. Like all of the stuff I had started working on of like not taking that negative thing and putting it on everyone. I was like, that's it. That was like the solidifying factor for me of like, I have a reason to not trust it. Like it's not helpful to hold that belief. So I've like worked on that. But finding the community was wild. I was very validated. I was very mad. I was very grieved. I was very like, what the heck? Like, I'm not alone. Like, this is a thing. Like, all these years I've been saying I think I had PTSD and nobody believed me. And this is like all the proof, not just in other people's experiences, but in actual research. Like, there's proof.
It's crazy.
I went feral for a little bit, just reading and texting people. I sent my mom the website. I'm like, Mom, like, you have to see this. It was a wild like experience, but positive. And then being in support group, like, and seeing all these people who had been through the same thing was like, whoa. Yeah, very much. And like my sister went through it. But I've worked really hard to be strong around her. Yeah, and make myself different when it's not people within your own family. Really, really positive finding the community. Crazy, enraging, but positive, you know? I see the community and I'm like, this is how we do something about it. This is how we can encourage each other to make our voices heard, to advocate for change and all of that. So
I definitely relate to the craziness of like the cycling of I'm like amazed but sad, amazed but angry. Like
and I'm like, yes, advocacy. Oh, grief. Oh, advocacy. Oh, wow, this is still happening. Oh, like, we're going to do this for Unsilenced. Oh, like, I'm so sad. Like, okay, but we're also going to make change. But like, this also sucks. And you just kind of go in the back and forth of like the tension between you're advocating for something that needs to change while still living with the effects and being involved in a community that's been so impacted by the effects. So there's a tension there, and it's good tension because it should be there. If there wasn't tension, it'd be because we were shutting up, and we don't need
I love that. I want to put that quote on my wall. We don't need to shut up.
We don't.
For any other survivors listening right now who are in the process of coming to terms with some of the things that you've already processed, is there something you found super helpful in your healing journey that you would recommend? Any advice or recommendations for them?
I mean, it's really obvious, but like, get a good therapist. I did EMDR and it was really solid. It's a lot, but I think it really, like, on a biological level, helped my brain to store these memories as past tense instead of active threat. And that's the whole point, really, with EMDR. Have people who you trust, who are safe people, who you can share your story with. When I was like 17 and I first did therapy, one of my first homework assignments was talk to somebody who you trust and tell them your story. And tell them your story with emotion and with the parts that actually hurt, instead of just going, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And for me, that was like the beginning of being able to actually reconcile things. Don't bottle it up, take up space, cry really loud, cry with all your vocal cords.
I love that.
I kind of had to come into terms with all of this. That was a big part of it, was like, I had so much anxiety about just facing the fear. Like, I was scared about the fear. I was having fear about fear. And I had to learn like how to be okay with it really sucking. And just deciding that I was going to be like, okay, it's going to suck really hard and I'm going to keep going. But that you're worth putting yourself into those moments. Just because it doesn't feel good doesn't mean it isn't good. Just because crying really hard sucks doesn't mean it's not good. There's nothing bad about crying really hard. We have to learn that, I think, a lot, because we get told to shut up, or we get told to stop crying or smile for the camera or whatever icky stuff the doctor said to you while you're on the table. You make your own rules. That was a big thing for me.
Very well said. That's such an overlooked part, is like being able to sit in the emotions instead of running. Like, we spend our whole lives like running from this thing.
Yeah, you have to sit in it. And if you won't sit in it for you right now, sit in it for the little girl who had to go through it, or the little boy who had to go through it, and wasn't allowed to sit in it then.